Tere õhtust Arhitektide Liidust. Meil on juba 3. suvepäev ja täna on meil viimane loeng sarjast eelloengud Konverentsile, Innovatsioon ja Digitaalreaalsus. Need eelloengud on mõeldud selleks, et ette valmistada ennast ja kolleege, Kunstiakadeemia üliõpilasi ja teisi huvilisi, kõik, kes ühinevad meiega, siis konverentsiks, mis toimub 6. septembril, nagu öeldud, Innovatsioon. Täna on meil palun sulgeda mikrofoni.
Üks korter ja.
Tänan. Ja täna on meil suurepärane võimalus kuulata loengut kaartidest ja kaardistamisest. Ja meiega on professor doktor Paezi Barcelonast ja ma võib-olla teen lühikese sissejuhatuse. Mul on siin väike spikker tema CV-ga, ma õppinud Barcelonas ja Kolumbias, teinud oma cum laude doktoritöö Barcelonas, töötanud Alison ja Peter Smithoni büroos, nagu ka meile kõigile tuntud Enric Miralese office'is. Ja täna juhatab Elisava arhitektuurikoolis, juhatab efemeerse ja ajutise ruumi õppetooli ning ühtlasi on laboratooriumi juhataja, kes tegeleb teadustööga just nimelt efemeersete ruumide valdkonnas. Ja tema doktoritöö oli kaartide operatsionaliseerimine. See on meil raamatukogus ka olemas, kes tahab seda vaadata. Ja ilma pikema sissejuhatuseta võiksime me alustada. Tehnilistest küsimustest võiks lisada nii palju, et kellel on küsimusi, palun need chatis saata siia ja loengu lõpus me esitame need ka Rogerile ja saame arutada. Lisaks on meil siin väike stuudio seltskond kogunenud, kellega me loodetavasti saame ka paar sõna pärast loengut siis diskuteerida nendel teemadel, milleks on siis kaardid ja innovatsioon kaartide tegemisel. And without further ado, I'll introduce you, Dr. Paezi. We just turn the computer and please, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yuri. Thank you, everybody at the Estonian Architectures Association. And also for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here and hopefully contribute to the lecture series. So I will put on my goggles and try to present. I missed it. Sorry, where is it?
Share screen.
Yeah, share screen, but I don't have. Okay, I don't know whether my.
I will come on.
Okay. Okay. Why is it not working now? All right. Okay, so sorry for the interruption. Anyway, so thanks for the invitation, and I prepared a lecture that basically has got 3 parts that connect to one another. Hopefully, I'm going to be not much longer than an hour or a little bit more than that. So. And then I would really like to have some debate or some questions, some comments based on your interest. So the idea of the main idea of the talk is that of mapping use as a tool for innovation. So innovative approaches also to mapping, and specifically how mapping can be used and is used as a design tool in architecture, but in all design disciplines in general. So I start with this image or collection of images with which I will hopefully also end, because the core idea of this lecture is already here. Basically, the first idea that I would like to introduce is the fact, which seems to be kind of obvious, but it's not so necessarily. We don't always think about it, let's say, in such a clear way. But the first idea that I would like to share with you is that there are many maps, that every map tells a different story about the world that we live in, that every story is worth it, and that every story is a path to both understanding and transforming the world. And this is the core idea of what I call operative mapping, or the operative use of maps in architecture or in design. These seem to be very obvious statements, but in truth, if we think about them, they're not so obvious in the way that we usually address maps. We tend to use maps in a very restricted way, basically in order to find places or to localize, but we don't really explore as much as we could the potentialities that maps have. And to me, the crucial question of the potentialities that a map has in design has to do fundamentally with this idea that they tell stories. They're narrative devices that through representation, if you will, they specify, they select, they choose certain aspects, certain parameters of the world in which we live in, and that we as architects transform one way or another. So it's very important for me to understand how this imagination of the world, if you will, it's already a construction that is a crucial aspect of design. So it has nothing to do with a conventional understanding of, let's say, analysis versus design. But the very first stance that we have on the world in which we live, that we transform through design, is very often through the map. So I will introduce the first part of the lecture is basically talking about a few concepts, a few words, really keywords that I think they're useful to begin to point out to this approach of mapping. The first one is fascination, and this comes directly from Robert Louis Stevenson, that in his book The Ideal House, when he explains how many desks should we have in a house. My favorite one is the empty desk. But anyway, there's one that, according to Stevenson, should be filled with maps and charts. And the reason why, he says, is that because of all printed materials, including books and prints and drawings and whatnot, according to Stevenson, maps are the ones that more stimulate and satisfy the fancy. So there's this this idea, very intuitive sort of approach, if you will, to maps that many of us have had, I'm sure, which they stimulate really imagination, and they're fascinating kinds of documents, especially when you don't know what they're about. You tend to look at them intently. You tend to try to decode and try to understand, and you project your own desires and imagination very much in maps that you don't necessarily know what they're about. So that's the first concept that I would like to explain. I will not talk so much about this specific map because I will talk about it later, but let's just say that without knowing much or anything at all about what this thing is about, it tends to call on our attention, at least to some of us. And it's a kind of document that, while being very complex very often, it also is extremely easy to access. It's very fascinating, let's put it this way. It strikes our imagination and our fancy. We get sucked in maps logic, if you will. The second keyword that I already introduced in the beginning is that of narrative. Maps are very strong narrative devices. This is as you can tell, it's a treasure map. I'm sure none of you have seen before. It's written in a language that's not Estonian or English or anything that you will probably understand, but you immediately understood what this thing is about. And not only because this is a typical treasure map like we've all seen and drawn before, but because it has this very strong narrative component, right? So we see clearly an island or something that looks like an island because there's a continuous line that is surrounded by something. We assume it's the sea because there's a boat there. And then there's the use of very different kinds. If you look at this very simple map drawn by a 6-year-old, 5-year-old actually, child, there's already lots of semiotic, if you will, dimensions that are put into play here. So for instance, there's the use of iconographic information, for instance, the boat or the chest or the spade, if you will. There's also the use of language and alphanumeric information. There's the definitions of the monsters and different things that you need to encounter, but also there's the use of graphic information, such as the use of arrows or dashed lines that begin to suggest a path, for instance, or an origin point, or the cross, of course. X marks the spot, being the place where the treasure is found. So it's already a highly sophisticated set of different kinds of codes, all of which contribute to suggesting a narrative. And here, of course, we could go on and on. We don't need to insist too much, but there's already very relevant questions that are addressed in this map. For instance, the fact that someone is looking for something, in this case, a treasure. That person must have had with him or her already the key, because there's a key that's drawn, and probably had a spade. There's a spade and an arrow that makes it very explicit that the spade was used to unearth something, which of course is the classic chest, right? And there's all the question of the difficult moments that the person needs to go through in order to get to the desired, let's say, moment. But look at also how, rather than going directly to the chest, that person has to go around the island, because as the map tells you, there's a high range of mountains, which in this case is depicted in a very iconographic way with snow-capped mountaintops. So we assume that it's very high and hard to go through. And also there's an invincible monster, sand monster, which is huge. It's as tall as the mountains, which of course makes it impassable, right, to go through there. So just to insist on the strength, on the strong narrative component that maps tend to have. A third keyword that to me is essential here is this idea of new visions, or to use Yuri's concept of the imagosphere here again, to try to expand on through images on how we understand the world, how we view the world, and so how can we transform it as designers. So this is a very simple example of a map. It's a series of maps, but this is just a detail of Barcelona square. And here, it's a relatively simple map, but the only decision that was made here is that rather than documenting or that drawing, if you will, the conventional, let's say, morphologic urban spatial limits, which typically are addressed in these kinds of maps, what was done here was to identify a performative aspect. So in white is every place, whether indoor or outdoor, doesn't matter, that is accessible publicly. So it begins to talk about a certain porosity of the city, which is very different in different parts of the built fabric, as you can see. And also, basically, as you can tell, this map is addressing action. So things that happen in the square rather than the specific, let's say, morphological features that make up this square, which is what's typically drawn in conventional architectural maps or urban maps. So this generates a new kind of understanding and a very basic, if you will, but very important new vision of this space, because the moment you start understanding this specific square, for instance, as somewhere where certain things happen, and they happen in relation to one another, you begin to understand the potentiality of this space in a performative way, if you will, something that allows different actions to take place that you would previously not have had access to. So it's very, very important, because the way we draw things, the way we represent things, the way we map things, of course, fundamentally builds up the possibility of transforming it. So we need to first understand certain specific parameters, certain things that are interesting or relevant to us as designers, and then if we're able to make them appear, if you will, in a very clear way through the map, then it's much easier for us to relate to them as designers and to transform it. Then there's the aspect of revelation, which doesn't intend to have any religious aspect, of course, but in a quite etymological, literal sense, is removing the veil, right? So trying to access different aspects of reality which are there, but unless or until you map them, you really cannot quite pinpoint them, you cannot quite understand them, and hence you cannot address them or transform them through design, which to me is the crucial aspect. So this, for instance, is an example of one of the drift maps that I do often when I go to cities. So rather than take pictures or sketch, sometimes I do these maps. And this is a map of Porto in Portugal, which, as you know, it's a very steep city. It's a city where topography is extremely complex, and it's a city where it's particularly difficult to understand and to orient even yourself with in a conventional map, because it's a planimetric representation of a city that really performs in a topographic way. So in one of the first times that I went there to try to understand a little bit better the makeup of the city, I did this exercise. And this map is the result of the exercise. It's called Behavioral Symmetry of Porto. And basically, the exercise is very simple. I went to A, which is the highest, let's say, topographically highest point in the city. And there it diverts into two slopes, two sides of the mountain. And basically, the exercise was to follow the slope as if I would be water, basically. So following the steepest slope and drawing the city according to the slope. And then, so what you see in gray here is the main slope, which is basically the main dry riverbed, if you will, or creek bed. And then the other streets that you can see, or urban spaces, are the tributaries. So the spaces that actually flow toward this main urban, let's say, axis. So what's interesting about that is that it begins to allow you to get very interesting readings of this specific city, where the right-hand side is the more formal city and the left-hand side is the more informal city. And both of them are organized according to this topographical logic, which seems obvious in a way, but until you actually do the exercise, until you, in this case, use your own body as a measuring device, and you get this map as a result of this action, basically, let's say, truth of this specific urban condition was not obvious, or was not available for us to understand and to be able to transform. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm referring to the idea of revealing, right? Something, the map allows us to reveal certain aspects of reality that exist, but they exist virtually, if you will, but they're not actualized necessarily until you actually map them. Another important question is that of mediation, how maps are a very interesting and very powerful tool, if you will, to mediate, and design is all about mediation. So mediate, I mean mediate between subjective desires and objective conditions that you need to deal with in any design, but also to mediate between designers, which is more and more a typical problem that we have. So I found that maps are very, very useful devices to allow this sort of constructive conversation. So this is to push it a little further. This is just an example of an ongoing work that I'm doing with a writer, where we're testing the potentialities of using maps as literary machines, really. So quite literally building maps that the prompt suggest or construct literary pieces, if you will. I'm not going to explain that in detail because it's quite elaborate, but this is we've tried it with different kinds of types of literature, and this is for short stories. In any case, this is in Florence, in Italy, and the first approach is is to run this diagram that you see on the left-hand side, the center part, the knight's tour, which is this movement in chess, where the knight can move all around the chess board without touching twice the same spot, and then use this as a pattern to move in the city, which is of course rather deviant, if you will. You know, the people that saw us there doing, you know, passing like 20 times to the same place thought that we were crazy, which maybe we were, but what's interesting is what different perspective you begin to get also, of course, on the very urban reality of Firenze. But then in moving in this strange, deviant way, then the question was simply to identify one specific urban moment that called our attention, identify it through a picture, which you see on the bottom part, and then put a title on that, which is what you see on the list. And then basically that is a way to transform the conventional, let's say, urban plan of the Firenze city center, which is a Roman castrum, so it's a very regular construction, into a diagrammatic movement system, which is what is in the middle, then into an iconographic collection of moments which we could not have understood or perceived without doing the action of actually being there. And then finally, a set of sentences that signify each of these specific urban situations. And that, of course, allows you to then translate any kind of, which is what you see on the right-hand side of the image, any kind of specific path that you follow through the city into a set of numbers, which are translated into a set of images and a set of basic, let's say, text that allow you to make up a short story, as you can see on the right-hand side. So just a very, again, a very extreme example of that mediation capacities of maps, but just to show how strong these really are. Another point that I would like to point out is the idea of parameterization, or the need that we have when we're mapping to choose a selected, very limited selection of parameters of the reality that we're mapping. You don't just go out and map Tallinn, you know, out of very specific aspect or very specific aspects. Some of these aspects are easy to measure, at least for us architects, for instance, are easy to measure. But things that are not so easy to measure are equally important, if not more important. But we need to find ways of being able to measure them somehow in order to map them. So this is when parameterization comes in handy. So this is just an example of public space parameterization based on the likelihood of people being in each spot. No? So this is a way to transform I think that's very complex to measure directly. So the likelihood of people being in a specific part of public space is not something that's directly measurable, but there's lots of different conditions that help you in a rather complex way. This is, of course, the result of a lot of previous work, but allows you to identify quite clearly these specific parameters. So in this case, this was used for a digital map that I will show you later. But basically here, the important thing that I would like to address is that we can, and indeed we should, I think, map aspects that are not directly and conventionally measurable. We just need to find ways of doing so. A very interesting aspect of maps too, specifically in the design world, is how they allow us to explore questions of abstract figuration. So going well beyond, let's say, conventional understandings of legibility. Typically, the typical map that has triumphed in the West and then in the rest of the world since the Renaissance is a map. It's what it's called the techno-scientific map, if you will, and it's totally based on military interest, to put it very clearly, and then eventually property, which sort of went on top of the military approach or understanding of the world. So it tends to try to avoid any kind of potential misunderstanding between what the map is trying to say and how the perceiver will read the map. But a more exploratory use of mapping, a more innovative use of mapping can really tap into other dimensions of mapping, which are not direct related to legibility, but they're related more to expressivity, for instance, or to abstract figuration. So, for instance, this is just a detail of a map that was made in the outskirts of Barcelona to identify questions of fencing and whatnot. And in this case, I'm again not going to get too involved in the explanation, but it was less important to identify or to be able to have a very clear readability of the map, and it was much more important to have a strong, let's say, expressive quality of the map, because this was associated with other kinds of documents, of course. And sometimes working with abstract figuration allows you to go beyond this limitation of, let's say, the conventional techno-scientific map. And that takes me to another question, which is the concept of factura, as it was conceptualized by the formalists, a long time ago. But I think it's a very relevant question, also related to what we were just talking about, which is how a different way, a different technique, if you will, and a different approach to the same specific map can give us very interesting readings, not only on that which we're mapping, but especially on the limitations of the technique or the methodology that we're following, which sometimes are more, or sometimes are just as interesting or even more interesting than what we're trying to address in the map. So this is an example of an exercise that was proposed by Edouard Cavé, where there's a protocol. This is basically a script, a very simple script, that's given to three entities. The left-hand side is a machine, a mechanical machine. The central image is a computer software, and the right-hand side is a human animal, myself particularly. So what's interesting is that none of us, three entities, were aware of the other entity's result or drawing, basically. And we all had the exact same protocol, and we interpreted it in quite similar ways, actually. It's quite impressive. But of course, you can tell the difference in the way in which it has been made, with all the specific conditions and specificities, and also limitations, in the best sense of the term, that come with the specific way of doing something. So that is just to insist on how important it is in maps also to decide how they're done. And that there's no specific way of doing a map that's better or worse than any other, but each of them will have its own specificities or its own let's say, interests, if you will. So far for the first part of the talk, which basically tried to address some bullet points on maps and my understanding of what I call operative mapping. The second part of the talk, it's more related on specific operations that we can make through mapping, and trying to then put a little bit into practice these questions that we address now in a rather, let's say, theoretical way, if you will. So the first obvious, let's say, operation that comes to mind is that of form, operating with form. So using maps in order to form find, after all, there's many ways in which you can do that. This is just one example, which again, I don't have the time, and I don't think it's the moment to go really deeply into all the examples. But basically, you see on the top left-hand side an initial understanding of a side map of the place we had to work in. This was a temporary installation that we proposed for a place in Catalonia where it's very warm in summer, and there's a very important theater, like street outdoor theater festival when it's sweltering. So we were asked to think about shade and basically well-being. Now, because the money was very, very tight, and because it was a temporary intervention, it didn't make any sense to build, large or more conventional, let's say, refuges. So the idea was, given the specific site that we were given, to identify, the first thing that we did on the top left-hand side, you see, is identify the existing poles or tree trunks that were big enough to hold some kind of structure, so to use as some kind of structure. Then on the right-hand side, you see the first attempt, or like a already optimized attempt of incorporating man-made, so temporary poles that would be situated in such a position that they would allow to network with the existing poles and tree trunks, and then that quite literally gave us a potential formal solution, which is what you can see on the bottom side, which I don't need to go into detail. And of course, it's also related to questions of flow and whatnot. But basically here, my point is that trying to, or understanding the site that we were given through a specific set of parameters, a specific vision, which in our case was trying to locate, let's say, vertical structures that we could use already, is something that allowed us to then identify potential places where we could put the little money that we had into these extra poles that we needed to add in order to generate a large, let's say, network of shades, basically, which ended up being something like that, but that's not today's point. Now, this is just an example. There's many others that have been used throughout at least the last 40 years quite intensively. But also there's other mapping operations that we can work with, which are not necessarily related to form finding or to helping us as designers, let's say, identify specific morphological configurations that work for us. But they're more related to what happens in the spaces that we work in, so questions of action. So this, for instance, is an intervention that we did in a square in the old town of Barcelona, close to the, right in front actually, to the Museum of Contemporary Art, which is a place that it's a place that's interesting. It's quite conflictive in many ways, especially because there's a tension between a more, let's say, civic urban use, mostly by more local people, of this large square in a more, let's say, conventional way. And exactly, and then there's a massive skating spot, world famous, which is very interesting, but that very often generates conflicts. So we were working there, and the first question was to try to understand what was going on there. So the initial map is a very, I mean, work intensive, but very conventional approach, reading from, on the left, you see fast movement, slow movement, fast movement, and stationary movement, so no movement. And the color is gender coded. And then on the top, you see the accumulation of all of these different moments. So basically, we did this map understanding in a specific day what was happening, what was going on there. And we used this knowledge to propose a one-day-long intervention, which basically consisted, it's super simple, it consisted of these 17 or however many, 18 big tables, 2x1 tables, actually stage set elements, but they, to the height of a table, that we used in 4 different configurations in a whole day. So we basically became some kind of theater performers in the urban space. We just changed the configurations of these tables to affect the way people were moving and were using this space, without programming, without doing anything there, without telling anybody what we were doing, just to identify what was going to happen. And what happened was very interesting, and without getting into detail now, it's just interesting to see how the first understanding, which is what you see on the top of what was happening in this space, prompted what you see in the middle, which is the specific event that happened there, which changed the way in which people used and moved and basically occupied this space, which is what you see on the bottom. So again, there's this feedback relationship between understanding, proposing, and acting, if you will. So in this case, as you can see, the use of maps is much more related to understanding action rather than form. But so far, we've always addressed mapping operations that are within the more traditional geographical, let's say, dimension, but we can also go beyond geography. This is a map of 5 days in Paris that it identifies simply the amount of kilometers that were walked in each day, because one of the protocols of these 5 days in Paris was that we were to access absolutely everywhere by walking only, so we could not use anything, including cycles or whatever. So that seems to be, again, a very reductive, very basic, very absurd, if you will, initial rule, but that totally died your perception of the city, especially when you begin to accumulate kilometers. And you begin to see things in a very different way. You begin to move like an animal through the city. You begin to find the easy ways in and out of Montmartre and whatnot. So this aspect became more important or very important. And so we wanted to make a clear point about that. So this is a very reductive, is one of the examples of the near zero maps, basically, that I'm very interested in, that talk about an action, that talk about something that is related to experience, and yet it purposefully denies any kind of, let's say, accessibility on this intimate experience, and only relates or communicates this aspect of distance without any reference on where did these people go and what did they do and why did they go there. But still, this is still to do with questions of physicality. We can also go beyond physicality, and this is an even more radical map. This is a map of 2 births, actually. So it's a very radical exercise where I was trying to map birth in a house, in a home, and actually, to talk about and to address the impossibility to, let's say, thoroughly represent, if you will, this rather strange and magical moment. The idea here was to use the more radically objectivistic of all maps, which is the military map, in this case, the Korean War system that the Americans devised, which, of course, it's done in a radically objective way for many reasons. The first reason is the obvious reason that when you're in the military, you want to make sure that you're understood and your orders are followed through. But also there's another, of course, just as important, if not more important aspect, which they don't write so much about, military commanders, which is how to objectivize war and remove all the blood, sweat, and tears from it. So all of a sudden, this becomes like a perfectly addressable question in process terms. It's like an engineering exercise. There's no blood, there's no sweat, there's no tears, there's no passion, there's no fear. There is nothing of the things that fundamentally define wars. And this is turned into a manageable, scientifically manageable problem, right? So here, of course, the idea was to force this to the extreme that you can see that it just doesn't work. But again, that was the attempt, how to begin to map what happens behind or on top of or beyond, sorry, the physical plane when there's such thing as giving birth. Until now, even including the last one, they're maps that most of them have got a foundation or a base, a graphic base in the plan that comes from a long tradition, especially in the West, but not only in the West. And it has many advantages, especially when the plan is related to scales that are more or less cohesive, because you can begin to overlay different levels of information. They can begin to talk to this geolocalization, whether it's digital or manual, right? But we can also work beyond the plan. We can definitely take mapping operations, specifically in design, beyond the plan. And I just want to share with you one example. This is right in the heart of Barcelona's Vanolin. There's a Plaça del Rei, which is the square of the king, where the king of Aragon had its main court. This is a place that's extremely rich with history. It's actually quite interesting, and you can see from the top just 3 plans of underground structures or structures that are beneath the current city level. On the left, you see the Roman houses and structures. In the middle, you see 6th and 7th century, basically, structures. On the right, you see 9th, 10th century structures. And then what you see actually in the picture is 13th, 14th century structures, which is what we can see right now. So the Museum of the History of the City has all these amazing documents, but it's very, very hard to try to understand, to really visualize all these superimposition of plans in a more or less intuitive way. So I was working with them to try to come up with a solution here. And this is what eventually I came up with. The original was not spiral, but you'll see why it spiraled. And basically the idea here was to map in section, because there's a very interesting condition that in old cities that, as you know, rubble keeps piling up, and so the datum level, the ground level, keeps getting higher naturally, and sometimes forced. The case of Prague is particularly interesting. How it was filled 3 or 4 meters in medieval times to avoid the floodings of the Vltava River. But anyway, this is very typical from any old town. So what we see here on the left-hand side to the right-hand side is a chronological time. So from ancient Rome to the Visigothic period, early Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, early modern period, and contemporary period. And then is the exact same spot where we identified with a lot of scientific precision, the specific height of all the structures that were there. On the left, you see houses of Roman times and some other, let's say, buildings that were there in Roman times. So what's interesting to see is that as time progresses, of course, there's many things that keep being built above the datum, above the ground floor, which is the big pieces, basically ended up being the cathedral and the King's Palace. Some of the underground structures are, yeah, sorry, someone should turn off the microphone. Hello? Okay. All right. So you can see how some of them were reused. So for instance, a dyeing factory meant to dye clothes in Roman times was used up until the early Middle Ages as a bathhouse. You can see here on the third section, etc. So you can begin to identify how the city evolves, in this case in section, in a very specific place. And you can also see how in current contemporary times, most of these are accessible again. I mean, they were underground, but now they've been made accessible again. So the city begins to have this very interesting porous quality in section. Now, I will insist with this example just to tell you that also beyond going again beyond the plan and working in section, we could also understand how we can go beyond representation. So how there are different ways of addressing maps as representation. Sometimes it's to register something that exists, but we can also simulate something that could be or could happen, which is very useful for us designers. So what happened, it's one of these coincidences, is in the office when we were doing the first map that I showed you on the top, which was basically a representation, however strange, if you will, or uncommon, but a representation of historical facts that are very easy to check, if you will, we have a lot of information on. We were simultaneously entering a competition for a design of a new city center in a garden city area close to Barcelona. So we, just by coincidence, it wasn't really planned, but we began to understand that this interesting condition of sectional porosity that we identified in a historical map of the center of the city of Barcelona could also be applied as a proposal, if you will, to solve this specific architectural problem that we were given in the contemporary outskirts of Barcelona. So what you see on the bottom side of this sectional map is again time, but here time is not chronological as opposite to the top part, but it's different phases. So potential phases from less to more investment or less to more stakeholders based on the program that we were given. Where could we locate the 4 more important and necessary programs, which is what you can see on the right-hand side, to where we could locate all of the many programs, more than 20 that we were given as an ideal situation on the left-hand side. So, and that is a little bit the story told very quickly. On the left, you see a 1931 picture where you can see the current, let's say, ground floor being excavated. You can see some of the Visigothic and some of the Roman ruins on the left-hand side. So it's I think it's a very interesting photo where the sectional quality of the city, the built matter of the city, right, is very, very present, which is something we tend to forget, or we just understand in historical terms, but spatially and materially and narratively also, it's a very, very strong aspect. So then we use this understanding of historical city center to suggest a design in a very different condition in a garden city. So taking advantage of the existing topography here, what we did was to artificially build this thick ground condition, basically where all of the main programs were located, and then the rest was generating these squares and this basically these spaces where eventually other buildings could be built, which is what you can see on the image on the bottom, right, which would be the image where all of the 20 plus buildings that they wanted to build here could be built. And on the top, you see where there's only the minimum infrastructure. So I think that what I'm trying to talk about here is how interesting it is, how you can go from a map that basically addresses understanding or representing something that has happened in chronological time, and then that map, the same mapping operation, the same logic really applies to suggest and to prompt an architectural proposal in the present. And also thinking of this idea of going beyond representation, so how to register and simulate at the same time, we can also address this through, again, not so much the morphological point of view, but also more the performative point of view. So this is an example that we did recently. This is a very detailed, very high scale or high scale map, if you will, high resolution map of the performance of a specific town square in a place close to Barcelona, where we identified and we studied very, very precisely the kinds of movements and the kinds of uses that happen there in a specific moment. So we did that with a high resolution, and we had a lot of hard data in terms, for instance, of how many people, what the proportion of gender was, the proportion of basic age groups were, the kinds of uses that people were naturally doing here. So we had a lot of, let's say, sociological, if you will, information based on the use of this space, current use, before we did anything. And then what we did was to generate a digital map, basically, well, a simulation. That is where the initial parameterization that I showed you before actually was done for. And then here we fed it the exact same data that we got from the observation map, from the register map, basically. And then we changed some specific parameters every time. In this case, it's just where do we place tables to generate some kind of a neighborhood, festivity or dinner or whatever. And based on that, simply how these places, this location of the tables is changed, we run the simulation and you get all these different potential or probable distributions of people in this space here. So that's what's interesting again here is that we are going beyond the strict, let's say, representational use of the map, and here the map is literally becoming a simulation that allows you to test design decisions at a certain level, and that's part of the story. What happened? And the final part of the lecture, if you still want me to go forward, is basically where I'm trying to more formally address the different ways in which maps have been used, to my understanding at least, in the last 40 years at least, in architecture, in urban design, in landscape design, I mean, design in general. And here I will very quickly introduce just basically four main modes, as I call them, four main ways in which maps have been used and can be used in design. So basically, the taxonomy that I'm proposing to you comes from addressing two different axes, if you will. The first one has to do with the direction. That is, whether the map is something that comes before the design operation, if you will, or the other way around. That is, whether we're designing based on whichever methodology that doesn't include any map, and through the very logics of design, a map is called for, basically, or the other way around, whether we're starting working with maps without any particular specific design intent in mind, and that working with maps prompts certain design proposals. That is what I call the direction. And in this sense, we can divide it in two basic modes, the internal or the external. Internal meaning the internal operativity would be where the map is the starting point and then design follows. The external operativity would be where there's a design logic that's previous to the cartographic logic, and then the map is sort of somehow called for. And then the second aspect is that of focus. That is, whether after using the map or in using a map in order to prompt design decisions, which is the very idea of operative mapping, whether we expand the possibilities of that design, and that would be the wide scope, the wide focus, or whether we concentrate or we further define, we delimit more specifically the design, and that would be the narrow focus. Now, based on that, when we cross these two logics, we have four basic kinds: visions, which are internal wide logics, constructions, which are internal but narrow logics, protocols, which is external and wide logic, and instrument, which is external and narrow. I will now explain a little more in detail. But I think that with this very simple approach, you can really identify all the ways in which maps are used in design disciplines, and not only design disciplines, but anywhere where understanding of reality is something fundamental to prompt new imaginations or inventions of reality. In the case of art, that's very clear. In the case of activism, is very clear. And in the case of policy, it's also somewhat clear, even if the use is usually not as strong.
Like opposite directions.
Sorry?
Vision and construction, opposite directions.
Yeah, the difference, I will try to explain it now with some examples, but the difference to me between visions and constructions is both of them are operations that start with a map, and that map somehow suggests design. But the difference is that visions basically open up what is an object of design, basically. So they're not so directed, and constructions tend to be much more
narrow and wide, where there are opposite directions.
Oh, the directions. No, this is just a way of making it graphic. We could find another way.
How you map it?
Exactly. Yeah. No, it doesn't. We didn't intend here to indicate that there would be different directions in the sense of where do we take this, because this is totally unrelated to the mode. That is, you can have a construction that goes in a specific direction and a construction that goes in a totally different direction. That's to do with your own subjective approach and your own interest. This is more to understand the relationship between map and design and how do they operate together. Hopefully it will be clearer when I run through some of these examples. Anyway, so the vision maps, which is this first, let's say, category, if I may say so, is basically these directed readings of reality, which affect how we perceive and understand our surroundings. Directed, it's very important, I insist. The map is always the result, it's a result always of a process of asking, if you will, something to our environment. So that something is the limited limited selection of parameters that we choose every time. And so when we direct the reading of reality in a certain way, vision maps tend to appear where they begin to open up many possibilities of transforming this reality through design, but not only through design, I insist, through activism, through art, or through policy, etc., in different ways. So this is the crucial aspect, how vision maps specifically reveal unknown or hidden aspects of the reality that we're working with, the city or the specific site that we're working with, and they form a vision that can be related to many different actions, design actions, and many of which, by the way, can be totally contradictory in the sense of the direction that you want to take it toward. Yeah, a good example of that, very simple example of that, is the roadmap, the more conventional roadmap, the Michelin guide, for instance. You would assume, or people assume, that it's done, of course, by Michelin producing tires, because they're promoting the automobile industry, and so they show Estonia, for instance, simply from the point of view of the roadmaps, the road hierarchy. That's what's important. But it's also a fantastic map if you want to, when you're doing a revolution, for instance, something about that in this country. It's a very interesting information to have, because you can decide where to cut off a specific place. So it's not, so the way in which you use the map is totally unrelated with a map. That's another question that we do not have time to go into detail, but I think it's a very interesting differentiation between maps and drawings. Lots of theoreticians have understood that the drawing would be, if you will, a snapshot, a specific moment of a projected reality or an existing reality, whereas the map is an open system of relations, and it does not have one way in or out. It has as many ways in and out as the perceiver who's using the map wants to. So the construction maps are a way of broadening our perceptions of the milieu, again, through operations in the map itself, which is understood directly as a projective technique. So rather than understanding the map as a solely representational system, if you will, or device or technique, by drawing on the map and keep drawing on the map aspects that you're mapping, of course, you're not projecting it in the conventional sense of the term, you begin to generate a density, if you will, to which you can relate as a designer, if you will. So specific issues are framed in the map, in the making of the map, and incorporated into the project in a way that it ends up characterizing the project, because the very basis where the project is made already carries all this information. So this is a technique that, for instance, Enrique Miralles used a lot. How to let's say densify so much a conventional site plan, begin to address so many aspects that are relevant or were relevant to him, that the very map then becomes the site of experimentation itself, and then architectural decisions are nearly basically just choosing from there, in a way. So it's a question of it's the opposite of the blank page, trying to really densify with other aspects of information that are not usually in architectural maps, in order for you to be able to take architectural design decisions. Actually, the example here is one such case. I mean, this was a design for the edge of a coastal town, and we decided that we didn't need to do anything on the edge because there was no money to do it, and it was already fine. And we just tried to identify what was happening in the bay, and we really mapped out with a lot of detail aspects that were not part of the common knowledge, and based on that, a suggestion for the intervention happened quite directly, basically, nearly choosing from this highly densified, let's say, landscape of information in the map. The protocols, which are the third kind, this is when we go into external operativity, if you will. This is when basically like a computer protocol, what the protocol does is regulate yeah, basically the transmission of information between different aspects of reality. And then based on certain design rules, you can operate on that. So like any protocol, like in a computer, basically what it does is it gets a data set, another data set, and it sees how they can relate. So basically here, what protocols map do is they read reality from a point of view that is linked already to design goals. That's why I'm talking about them as external. So first you have certain kinds of interests, and then you try to protocolize this in a way so that every time that you get new information, you will be generating a slightly different or not so slightly different way of mapping it out, and so relating with this changing flow of information. I will show some examples. And then the instrument maps are the more simple kinds of maps. These are where already from a design point of view, you have a certain clear idea on where to go, and then you devise a map in order to specifically address or help you choose very specifically some aspects of that project. So in this case, for instance, it was a case of a housing project with a very bad orientation. It was north-south, pure north-south, and that forced half of the let's say of the apartments of not having south sun, which was not acceptable. So then there was the proposal of a typology that it's not that's unheard of in Barcelona really, which is opening up the courtyard, a very thin, the minimal legal courtyard, onto the street, which was pure south, in order to get sun inside. So this is a decision that is not related to the map. There was a decision that was related to basic, housing typology and orientation. But once that was already addressed, then the question was how to take specific design decisions. In this case, the facade treatment, which was basically had 4 kinds of finish. With slight different reflectivity qualities. And here the idea was to, as you can see on the top, there's the sun map, the amount of sun that touches these facades.
Direct sunlight?
Yeah, direct sunlight. And then on the bottom, you see a direct translation of putting a darker, more absorbent, if you will, finish, where there's more light, and a clearer and more reflective where there's less light, with the idea of trying to make all this space more balanced and more similar light conditions. So otherwise you would get a very strong differentiation between the ones that have a lot of sun and the ones that don't. So again, this is the instrumental use of maps. So to really take a specific design decision. Yeah, it did work. Yeah. Okay, and just a very, again, a rather deviant case study to explain how all 4 modes can be used here. I'm saying deviant because it's a very strange and quite radical design approach. In my book, Operative Mapping, Maps as Design Tools, there's lots of examples of famous architects using all these different let's say modes, and explained in a clear way. But here I thought that it was better to use just one example. So this was a project for an international project to design a prison in an abandoned oil platform in the middle of the Pacific. I entered it because I was very much against the very initial idea of the proposal, because it suggested that the best way to deal with the penitentiary was to make it extremely isolated. And my point is exactly the opposite, that the more relationship there's between a penitentiary and the city, the better for everyone. So anyway, the first aspect, the vision use of that in a way was the whole competition A0 panel. There was just one panel that you could present, and they were asking for all sorts of details, and the decision was to present only that you can see. So again, everything except for the image of the New Zealand Herald. Here it's all maps. So we're trying to make a point, even in terms of vision, how to address very critically, if you will, this competition's initial hypothesis. So again, based on that, there could be many design decisions that would come after that. Just to go more into detail, now the instrument map, these are instrumental use of maps, for instance. Of course, we were given a site which we disregarded in the middle of the Pacific. So then we had to choose, where do we go from all the Pacific? Because of course the site was not defined by the competition. Well, it was, but we did not go for it. So here, the idea is why is it an instrument map? Well, because it is an external operation. That is, we already know by decisions that are unrelated to maps that we want to work, we do not want to work anyway where we were given, the site that we were given. And so the question now is how to identify specifically which site could be a potential site for us to work in. So we just need to narrow down to specify a site that has certain conditions that we can read through map. So here, the decision was to identify the areas with higher tidal ranges. And you can see there's 3 in Alaska, basically, in Panama, Ecuador, and in New Zealand. And so based on these 3, we decided to go for New Zealand because the first one was way too cold and with no people there. The second one was close to countries that probably would not appreciate our, let's say, extra progressive approach to penitentiaries. And the last one worked well. So the identification of the initial area to work with is actually done through a map that helps us in an instrumental way to identify a site that already has some preconditions that are performatively relevant for what we want to do. The second use here would be the construction map, and here it's a totally different logic. So here we start, once we located the site that we knew, that we discovered, because we of course did not know that site, that we discovered that had some conditions that were relevant for us. I didn't say why did we want high tides, but it's because high tides would allow us to avoid conventional fencing systems, basically. So we could work in ways that to us were much more interesting and much more relevant. So anyway, once we identified the place, which is called Manukau Harbor, of course, we didn't know that before. We got there through the map. Then there was a construction map. So we took the site, we didn't know anything about it and had no money to go visit. And of course, it was outside the site given by the competition, so no information was provided. So the idea here was to start filling it up with all the information that we could master here, of all different kinds. So from bathymetry, so that is the topography, if you will, of the depths of the channels, which were very important for us because this is where the water flows in and out of the harbor, which was something important for us in terms of safety, as I told you. But also questions we found there that we didn't even know. For instance, in red, you see volcanoes. This is a volcanic area. And also the identification of certain natural reserves, which are dotted lines. And we also drew the basic structure of the city there, because it was relevant for us that wherever we worked would be part of the city. And we also happened to find, again, we didn't know and we didn't choose, but that the airport was very close. And so we drew in blue the Jeppesen airport map approaches, also to try to begin to understand where would these access routes of the planes be, etc., etc. So there's lots of information that begin to make up this map, and that allowed us to choose within this general area, specific area, which is what you can see on the top right-hand side, which is an island that's connected by a causeway that has been, it's above a volcano that has been partially destroyed, and we thought that would be a great place. And then we go to the last typology, if you will, of mapping operativity and design, which is the protocol. So here, what we wanted to do, our desire in terms of design, or as designers, was to generate a nomadic prison, basically, something that would be more a service than an infrastructure, if you will. So we were looking for areas that were close to the city, but they needed work, and work that it's usually not easy to do, if you will, or not necessarily very desirable to do. And so we could put the work that inmates do getting paid a minimum wage and whatever, but we could put it to a direct productive use that's socially beneficial immediately on site. So it's not a question that can be incorporated through other means of industry or whatever. So related to that, it was very important for us that the prison would not be a clear conventional compound with very clear in and out of prison, but it would have these boundaries of varying permeability. So going from the initial part, which is accessible for all basically, to the part in Puracao channel, which is where the dorms are, etc. As you can see, which is highly restricted only to inmates. And the way to do that was to identify the areas that are in white, which are areas that are ecologically destroyed because of extraction of the soil to actually to build the airport. And the idea here was to work our way through a map, which again protocolizes how to go from top to bottom, following the slope, and identify the spaces that could be ecologically rebuilt, and then build also partial structures in these areas there. So again, this is a map that allows you to begin to relate questions of infrastructure or use, or kind of buildings that you need for the prison to work, also related to a specific work that is intended to happen here, which is that ecological restoration of half of this island, and to its specific condition, in this case, basically of topography. So again, this architectural design here is, or architectural, this is more urban, is highly informed by this understanding of the map. So I think that it's more than enough. I just have a few conclusions. I don't know whether maybe we just very quickly present them in order to further discussion, or we just leave them here. I don't know, however you want to. What do you want me to do? Okay. Okay, so just very quickly, just to have this as a potential guide for discussion. I don't want to get in detail here, but there's these 6 points that I think they're relevant. The first has to do with the operative qualities of maps and mapping. Which are the specific qualities that maps have and mapping as a process have that relate it so easily to architecture and to design. So there's a few that I think that are very important. The first one has to do with what I call exteriority, that is the ability that maps have to generate a friction with outside conditions that somehow then is incorporated into the very map. The map is really always the result, if you will, of this friction with an external reality to itself, which is what makes it very interesting, what makes it really a revealing device. That's something that's interesting. You don't need to know, that is, you cannot really know in advance what the result of the map will be. You just know a basic protocol of reading something, and you address it, and then you run it, if you will, and the map is the result. The other is the multi-scalar, let's say, condition or capacity that maps have. You know, they have the ability to work simultaneously on multiple scales, which is something that, in terms of design, is something very important to when you're working on a certain scale. Very often we have other scales nested into that. Then the embedded relational logic that the map has, because the map works as a territory in itself. So the questions of proximity or contiguity are relevant. So that's something that relates very much to spatial condition. And temporality, which is interesting because it doesn't seem obvious, but if you look at it, you see how maps allow us, and actually for a long time they have been used to incorporate time in spatial representation. Sometimes very long times, like geological time. Sometimes very short times, like action time, if you will. But since at least the 18th century, there's already a lot of work of maps that begin to talk about this sort of dynamic aspect of reality. And to me, what's interesting is that, of course, not only through mapping, but let's say that this approach to mapping, this operative mapping that I'm suggesting to use, and that has been used intensively in the past 40 years, allow us to push different new design objectives. This idea of a design that's more based on enabling necessarily, rather than conventional understanding of solution provider solving a problem once and for all and then implanting it directly, right? So the idea of enabling, understanding something that's going on and then working with it. Strategic approaches to design, but also tactical approaches to design that have a lot to do with reading what's going on, which is the specific dynamics in a specific moment, and how can we intervene there. And then a very activist approach to design, which is again based on this careful understanding of different dimensions or aspects that define our habitats, which are not only that of property and morphology, which are the typical ones that we use in architecture. In terms of design methodologies, there's lots of things that come to mind, but just to summarize, they allow us to work with narratives that are that go well beyond the autonomous disciplinary bounds of architecture. They allow us to introduce other logics, which are, of course, relevant in the city. I mean, the city does accumulate and actually relate to many other narratives, which are not the conventional architectural or design autonomous logics. It also allows us to design or to think of a design methodology that's based on protocolizing something, on understanding a certain way of something that works, protocolizing the way in which certain things work and how they perform, really, and then being able to understand design as a way to add, remove, or hack into this way in which things work. That becomes hackable, transformable, if you will, because we do have this document, let's call it the map, that allows us to identify this precisely. Of course, maps have been used extensively, even if not necessarily in a very interesting way always, in advanced computer technologies, which allow us to think of the map in a much more expanded way than the conventional map. Very typically now maps are databases, basically, that allow you to let's say, produce specific on-demand maps based on a specific, let's say, moment or specific situation that you want to work with. So there's lots of ways in which advanced computer technologies are fostering really advanced mapping systems in a very interesting way. And then game theory also, how the map is has typically, again, it's a historical question, also has been a very strong let's say a very strong format, I want to say, to foster this relational quality and this mediation aspect that we were talking about before, and has often been used as a game board of sorts. It is like it generates this sort of plane of consistency. It has a certain set of rules that allow us to somehow suspend, immediate subjective needs and desires, and be able to relate through, with another person, maybe very opposite, through these game-like logic. In terms of design formats, there's lots of things that are going on, which lots of people have talked about and written about, right? From questions related to imagery, the idea of remote control or soft control, call it whatever you will, the fact that we can design processes that have a very strong impact, but we don't necessarily need to design the final result in the conventional sense of the term, or at least not always, which relates to the idea of open solutions, how open solutions can be something more than just let's say, a policy decision. It's something that is highly designed and yet not necessarily in the conventional sense of the term of a finalized, object-related design. Working with emergence, with these things that the logics and the basic intelligence that happen when you begin to accumulate and to iterate certain logics. Form finding, we already dealt with. Mediation systems and negotiation, which is a specific aspect of mediation that has been, that is very important, should be more important, I think, clearly in urban design. And then all kinds of new authorships that come from that. Again, all of these that I'm saying, it's not only because of this kind of use of maps, but certainly it's a very strong, let's say, component of it. How right now, the collaborative frameworks and the idea of the designer as a mediator is a very important one. How we can think of design not necessarily only in the sense of a manufacturer of products that are totally finished. How can we also curate, or how can we become masters of ceremonies, if you will, of other dynamics that happen around us, and that we can somehow capture, and we can somehow relate to, and we can somehow transform, right? And fundamentally, this idea of projective survey, which is to me very important, how in a nutshell, an operative use of mapping to me is related with this need of having of being able to push an effective transformation of our urban milieus, or our milieu, by drawing on or understanding that which already exists, which is so much richer and so much more powerful than the very limited way that we typically have of understanding suggests. So to me, it's very important. How can we work simultaneously exploring this reality that is extremely rich? I claim that it's immensely rich, basically, but at the same time refusing to submit to the tyranny of what already is, you know. So being able to open up our understanding of reality in order to be able to transform it through design and to keep working with that. So yeah, that would be the basic conclusion, which I leave you here to read, if you will, and I'd be very happy to start a dialogue rather than such a monologue as it has been so far. So
thank you, Roger. I hear enormous applause, the digital one there, until we read the conclusions, and then maybe we switch off the sharing so that people can see you and look if we have any questions and discussions. Thank you very much for this really intuitive and at the same time comprehensive way of going through the maps.
Sorry, you wanted me to keep it there, you say?
Yeah, few seconds more.
Yeah.
Okay, let's read it again then.
Well, I lost it again. Okay. No, I just want to. Okay. Well, just to insist on that. One of the main points here would be that there's a very rich relationship between maps and design, and this is something that has been put into practice in the field, an expanded field of architecture, consistently for the past 40 years. And actually, in my book Operative Mapping, that's exactly what I'm addressing in the last part, no, through many case studies. In addition to everything that has already happened, to me, what's interesting is how this is opening up new avenues for exploring operative mapping in design in the immediate future, which is something that many of us are doing throughout the world, and I think it's very interesting. The other conclusion, which is important to me, and specifically also in this framework that we are right now, is that even if the examples that I refer to in the book are purposefully, all of them, I think all of them, if not most of them, by professional architects doing professional work, because I wanted to make a clear point about that being used already in the past 40 years in a very systematic way, if you will, but maybe not conceptualized in such a clear way. To me, the academic world has been a crucial, let's say, laboratory where these questions have been addressed and have been explored and still are being explored. So it's very, very important to be able to keep doing that. So because very typically, well, there's design practices, at least many design practices that are, let's say, if not sequestered by market logic, as I say here, at least very, let's say, removed from the possibilities of exploring in a radical way what architecture can do. And then the last conclusion is basically that from every point of view, professional, academic, activistic, artistic, or any other context, it's important to research and to experiment in serious ways in order to forge new paths to expand on the possibilities that that mapping has, in order to, and this is what we're talking about, of course, in order to foster design, and advanced design and explorative design that would serve us all as a society. So this would be the main point. But maybe it's better if we address specific questions or comments.
There's one very practical one before we go to discussion, more, I would say, general or philosophical question. Is the practical question that came to the chat is, how did you simulate the movement in the Barcelona city square? Did you just give your best guess, or did you use some specific tools?
No, of course. Very important. And I'm not going to explain the details for many reasons, because one, it would be boring, and two, it is not the object of the talk. But I think that what underlies your question is very crucial. When you're mapping, you're not making your best bet. Never. That is that to me, it's a crucial definition of map, or distinction, if you will, between a map and many other kinds of graphic formats, which are very interesting and that we use as designers all the time, and so we should, but they're not maps.
Imaginary map?
No, still we need an imaginary map, and there's plenty examples, if you will. They still have a very strong protocol. So to me, it's very important because it's philosophically, basically, it's essential. What I'm saying now, it's very important to understand that the map is a result of a friction with some kind of reality, an urban reality, or whichever reality. It can be from a formal point of view, from a performative point of view, from whichever point of view. So you need to address, first you need to select the specific, let's say, parameters that you're working with, and then you work out a specific way of coding that through a specific protocol of reading it, if you will. So, for instance, your best bet. No, you never do your best bet. Given your limitations, because of course you always have limitations, you need to be consistent with the way in which you use them, and you need to be consistent across the field that you're mapping. And this is very important, because otherwise you cannot get the revealing component that I was referring to. In order to be able to reveal some condition, to be able to compare, and to be able to read in a meaningful way the result of the map, there can be, the noise should be minimized. So if I start changing the protocol through which I'm mapping, for instance, the degree of resolution, or the scale, or the specific, let's say, parameter that I'm mapping, then I'm going to end up with something that's totally cacophonic. I'm not going to be able to understand. So in the specific case of the square that you're talking about, the first map was a map that was done through observation and through machine learning protocols, basically. So because machine learning allowed us to, for instance, follow tracks of people, yeah, but it did not allow us to understand what was going on there. So then we also had on-site observation there, mapping out exactly what was going on in a very precise way for one specific day. So that's the first map that I showed. The series of maps that I showed in the simulation aspect or part were taking the same data that we had from the map that simply registered what had happened, and then running it through a simulation motor. Yeah, a program basically that basically worked with autonomous agents in this specific case. I don't want to get too technical, but anyway, it worked with autonomous agents with the specificity that the agents were given some characteristics based on the hard data that we had from the registration part. So there were as many agents as there had been, as people had been in the first part. And I don't know, older people moved slowly, for instance, kids would move quicker. And then the hardest part of doing that simulation was to design the ground where these autonomous agents would move, based on that likelihood of someone being there parameter that I was referring to in the beginning. So we addressed it through lots of let's say approaches. Again, I don't want to be comprehensive because it will get very boring, but a simple one. If there is something built there, like if there's a concrete wall, nobody can be in the wall in principle. So that would be a 0, clearly. But then we identified questions like the kind of pavement. Is it a soft pavement or a good pavement, or is it like a broken down pavement? More or less likely for people to be there. It's summertime in Barcelona, so is it shaded or not shaded? Shaded, more likely for people to be there. Is it sloped or not sloped, etc. So accumulating all sorts of very different, very simple to identify parameters. With that, you end up with a very refined, if you will, and precise, let's say, identification of the likelihood of people being there. And then basically we run the hard data that we gathered from the first map, which was a register map, through a simulation protocol based on this simulation motor based on this protocol.
So this gender division was also based by the site observation?
Yes, in this case, yes. And of course, it's very relevant to discuss whether it's relevant or not and why and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, in this case, it was age, basically 3 kinds of ages, gender, and then the specific things that people were doing, which of course can, right now that we know of, can only be done through direct observation. That's why it worked well in a very specific localized square for one specific day. To do this systematically, it would be enormously difficult. But no, just to go back to your question, to me, it's never about your best bet. It's always about your best bet of being consistent, basically. You need to find the way in which you can be consistent when you're mapping. Otherwise, the results you're going to get may be very, very sexy, but they're not going to be useful. And this is important conceptually to me for a couple of reasons. One is that one of the most important aspects of mapping to me, we talked about it very briefly when we mentioned the vision aspect, is that it generates new understandings of the world in which we live. And so by that, it helps us to, as a stepping stone, basically, to change it, to transform it. So the map always has a surprising quality. When you map something, you never know what you're going to end up with, which is one of the beauties. Right? It's a result, and then it allows you to enrich your understanding of that specific reality. So that's, to me, very, very important.
When you started, you were showing this treasure island map, which of course reminds us of the maps that we have been drawing. I think most of the children have been drawing the maps. And maybe even before they are maps, they are drawings that incorporate both the planner and also the narrative issues. So they are very synthetic in a way. And then children learn, and gradually this synthetic quality of the space disappears. But then again, they appear again in a very boring version when fantasy writers invent some kind of a world, and they have to have a map. So the first, I have always been curious, are they drawing the map beforehand and then write the story into the map? Or the other way around, that the story is there, then they are mixed up in their ideas. What is happening where? And then they have to make a kind of reference point for themselves. So in between these, how would you comment it, or do you have any ideas to look at this very innocent understanding of mapping the world. And then, in a way, of course, there you go to the professional side, but also into the everyday side of our life.
Yeah, you actually touched on many things now. So I think that the answer would have to be multiple here. Let's start with something I think is very important. You mentioned the synthetic quality of these maps, and this is very important to me. And one of the strengths that maps have now, even printed 2D maps, I mean, as opposed to much more complex. I mean, one of the problems with digital maps sometimes is that it is hard to retrieve some specific information that will have this world-making quality, this vision-like quality. And that is because maps have worked traditionally with this synthetic worldview, which is very, very interesting. And we can go back many years. If you think of medieval Mappa Mundi, for instance, they incorporate, of course, they incorporate geographical knowledge, but also, you know, religious dogma and all sorts of, you know, imagination going on there. So let me just say that I don't think it's necessary for every map to have that, but tendentially, yes, this overview quality that maps have, this synthetic quality that the maps have, is a very, very strong, one of the strongest, if not the strongest, let's say, component that they have. James Corner, actually in a very relevant architect that article, sorry, that he wrote in '96, I think it is, which is very much along the same lines of what I'm talking about here, refers specifically to this overview capacity that maps have. So maps generate this, they sort of set the game board, and they set the logics within which a design can begin to happen. And so in this sense, they're highly creative, which is something that we're usually not so much aware of. You know, we tend to use a very restricted approach to maps. That's why I try to explain to you now much more exuberant or exaggerated or even absurd or deviant maps, which I think is very, very important because we need to expand on our vision. But I think that the question of the overview or the synthetic quality is one of the strengths of the map, because the map allows you to put together nearly, I mean, any kind of information that you can think of, alphanumeric, textual, iconographic, graphic, etc., in the same plane of consistency again. So it's something that once it's in the map, it reacts immediately, it rearranges the whole map. Someone wrote about this idea of Xeroxing a map before, you know, when people used to Xerox, you know, that sometimes there was a fly or something there. So once the fly is Xeroxed onto the map, it becomes the map. You know, it is not, you know, you cannot take it out of the map. It has this quality of consistency, if you will, which fosters this synthetic view, which to me is very, very important. Very, very important. The second aspect that you talked about, which I also think it's a very interesting point and quite complex, I guess, to address now quickly, but is the relationship, I'm reading it this way, the relationship that you have, so let me put it, how can I put it in a simple way? How mapping is a process that is a process of learning directly. No? And in the case of children, Piaget explained that very, very clearly. No, the developmental psychology understands how it is through play, it is through testing, it is through trying, through action, through experience, really, that we begin to construct even our taxonomies and our certainties, if you will. And so our knowledge is built based on that and not the other way around. It is really the case in maps, especially when you go a little off the beaten path, even in adults. So when I'm doing maps, I'm learning all the time, and that's one of the things, one of the reasons why I find them so interesting. So yeah, the treasure map is a very clear example on how the child, when it's drawing that, on the one hand is referring to like a basic protocol that is understood and it's narratively addressable. And on the other hand, it's testing, it's pushing these boundaries. Also to deal with questions that are scary or questions that are, not so easy to deal with. So the monsters and all the, things that happen there. So I think that what's interesting in what you're saying there is just to try to narrow it down to something that we can say now, is that maps not only generate knowledge that is actionable, that is that somebody else can use in order to do something, but I would say most importantly, they generate knowledge in the making of the map that that affects you and that you can apply even in ways that are very counterintuitive. And a good example would be this small example that I showed you on how a map that we were doing in the office that had simply the idea of trying to account for a historical evolution of one part of the world, Barcelona, right, was then used in a totally different way, totally unplanned, as a projective device to design and to propose something else entirely different, right? So that's something that it's very important to me. To me, it's not so much the specific knowledge that the map generates in itself that is actionable, but most importantly is the way in which it allows us to look at the world, that expands our way of looking at the world, and hence that is where there's a lot of possibilities going on. In the case that I was just telling you, the project, the city center project that we developed based on that map was using none of the factual information that was unearthed, if you will, by the first map, but it was using a certain way of looking at the city, in this case, with this idea of the porous topography, right? So again, that's what I'm quite fascinated by. I mean, that there is no direct instrumental relationship usually between what do you learn and how do you apply it, in life in general and maps particularly.
All the maps are subjective.
Sorry?
All the maps are subjective.
Yeah.
Are always the mapping subjective? Like the history is always subjective.
My quick answer to that would be yes, and also objective, and also intersubjective. That's what I would say. That is, it's very important to understand that yes, all maps necessarily, to me, are necessarily subjective because there is no such way as an objective way of referring to reality. However much we're banged into the head day in, day out with Google Maps and the military apparatus, right? Yeah, that's one way of, or the property apparatus. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. But of course, reality is so much more complex and rich. I always ask my students when they're doing something that's related to an urban scale, and they are using these very typical analytical tools, which they're fine. I'm not suggesting to not use anything else. I'm just saying we need to use something more than these very conventional analytical tools. So they're working, I don't know, say like a ground floor, a figure ground map or a conventional, I don't know, let's say circulation map of the city. I always ask them, if you can tell me any experience that you've had in a city that is relevant for you as a person, as a designer, can it be boiled down to any of these things that you're talking now about the city? And the answer is always no. We're always interested and we're always affected by things that are much more complex or much more simple, if you will, but they cannot be boiled down to, say, urban morphology. So I think that the map is always subjective in the sense that it starts with a desire, with a will, with a need, with an interest, which is subjective. It can be shared, of course, but it's subjective. A map doesn't make itself. But then there's a second phase that I think has to be objective, and it's the phase, this phase that I was referring to before, where there needs to be a consistency in the way in which you address the the subset of reality that you're mapping in a cohesive and coherent way. If you're not objective in this moment, then what you're doing may be very interesting, but it's not a map the way I understand it. It will be your direct projection of something. Yeah? And then to me, there's a third phase that's intersubjective. That is when if you're doing this properly, your subjective desire or interest, let's say, muscled up by the objective approach, if you will, allows it to become an intersubjective mediation system, really. So the way in which you have seen the city, because of your interest and because of the way in which you have your subjective interest and the way in which you have objectively, let's say, addressed it, allows you to share with me and somebody else this specific interest. But then I will use it in a totally different way than the way in which it was intended by you, which is what's interesting. It's like sometimes a good image is making a map is like wearing specific kinds of goggles, right? So so you invent the sunshades because you are interested in I don't know, in not getting sunburned. And then once this exists, I can take them and I can use them to look cool in a disco at 4 o'clock in the morning. So it's a different way of looking at the world. It does have and is to me necessarily a subjective starting point, but it also has an objective sort of midpoint and an intersubjective endpoint for it to be successful, I think. But yeah, it's important to understand that maps are not value-free descriptions of the world. Maps are not mirrors on reality as it exists in a, as if it would exist in an autarkic way, like independent to the perceiver. That is to me not the case. To me, reality is constructed specifically through the way in which we look at it, or through the way in which we address it. And in our case, in the case of designers, maps are one, not the only, but one of the ways in which we construe this reality, from which we really propose transformations.
I have a question about Google Maps. It came to our lives like 15 years ago, and now the result is that we do not use paper maps anymore, because Google says that you have to turn right now and then turn left, and how many minutes it takes. And like how Google Maps has like what has been the influence of it to us, like to this, how we see the maps and how we use maps?
Massive, and to be very simplistic here, I will try to be a little less simplistic now, but massive and very wrong. Let me try to address this a little. Massive for many reasons. Objectively speaking, there's more maps produced now in 1 year. I don't know whether it's the data now, but a few years ago, in 1 year, there were more maps produced than in the previous history of mankind. Yes. And now we use maps for nearly everything, especially related to the idea of geolocation or geotagging, because what that does, that's really an invention of the late 18th century and early 19th century, where they started to make something they called chorographies, which were maps that would represent data that was not geographical, but through a geographical distribution. For instance, density maps, or how many poor school children are there in France based on departments. So these kinds of maps, which to us now are very typical, were conceptually very important, because it was the first time that a set of data or information that was not related to geography, which was the typical conventional Western map, if you will, were geographically located, and then you could read certain things based on that. If you remember, for instance, the very famous map by Dr. John Snow, the one that discovered that cholera was actually transmitted through tainted water, made a map in the mid 19th century in London, which became very famous even in the history of medicine. because back then, that it wasn't clear. I mean, the concept of microbia didn't even, wasn't properly accepted by the scientific community. So there were all kinds of theories on what was happening and why people were dying of cholera so much in London in that case. So what Dr. Snow did was an operation that was very simple, but it was revolutionary then, which was he picked up part of Soho where there had been a massive mortality in, I can't remember the exact year, mid-19th century, sorry. And he identified where each dead person from cholera lived with a dot. So 1 dot per dead person. And again, we go back to the objective aspect. 1 dot placed one on top of another, perpendicular to the door, right? So that we can see clearly who lives in the same house, basically, that dies of cholera. And then across identifying the water pumps. Just putting these two sets of information together, it became immediately obvious that there was one water pump in a specific street that was tainted with cholera, and that was used actually as it was one of the documents that was stronger basically in shifting even scientific, let's say, general knowledge on the fact that cholera was transmitted through tainted water. So this is basically geolocalization. So identifying a set of data A, B, C, D, whatever, on a specific XYZ point. Yeah. So this idea, which is old actually, has now become like absolutely, let's say, generalized everywhere. And so what happens to me, when I said wrong, what happens to me is that even if it's true that maps are more present now, if you will, than in any other time in history, the way I see them, they're a very poor aspect of a version of maps. It's always the exact same map, just multiplied, just changing the ABC. But it's the exact same, epistemologically speaking, basically, is the exact same map. It's always identifying which is the best club or which is the quickest way or which is whatever in a specific XYZ spatial coordinates. So in this sense, on the one hand, there's a lot of interest in maps because they have been used basically just to tag other information. But on the other hand, there has been a massive loss in the kind of knowledge that can be addressed and built and transmitted through maps. And it's true that there's now lots also, I mean, people like myself and many other people that are working with non-Google, post-Google maps. But yeah, it's a very good question. It just requires a whole.
What is post-Google Maps?
Or before Google Maps, non-Google. Let's say non-Google Maps. No, in the sense that trying to relate spatiality and narrative in a way that it's not that of Google Maps, which is basically identifying, geotagging any kind of information in a very conventional spatial set that's preset. So Google has a very conventional way of understanding what the city is, based, for instance, on the distinction between public and private and property structure, period. It doesn't really tell you other aspects of the city, which are much more relevant, I would say.
Maybe the maps we see are poor, the Google Maps, but maybe the real maps the Google has, like this
hidden data,
databases of big data.
Absolutely.
They are like going on behind the curtains. So,
absolutely, and there's lots of people that are doing very interesting jobs there. I mean, there's at Columbia, there's the Center for Spatial Research. In Barcelona, there's for instance, a very interesting studio that basically works with that. How can we take this large data, or sometimes big data, not necessarily always big data, and how can we use this information that's zeros and ones basically, and how can we begin to spatialize it and transform it graphically into something that really expands our way of understanding our reality? Because I totally agree with you. The deep knowledge that is generated, not by Google Maps only, by these little robots that I see in Tallinn all around the place, giving you a pizza. Even if the, let's say, the instrumental narrative will be that it brings pizza to your home, if you will, directly, and that's all you need to know. What these robots are doing, of course, is they're gathering information on how to navigate a city from the point of view in an automated way, right? And that is generating a lot of information that goes well beyond the immediate, let's say, result of bringing you the pizza. So what's interesting is, and what we need also is people, I would say now, just to simplify, but people on the one hand that explore radically different modes of mapping. So for instance, mapping things that have not been mapped or mapping them in different ways. And also people that are able to hack into all of these massive data sets and be able to generate new contemporary images of the world we live in, which it's incredible. I mean, Google Maps is extremely, traditional, or even more than traditional. It's kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Reactionary, right? In the way in which it projects a certain image of our, spatial at least, image of our world. No? And yet the kind of information that underlies it, of course, can be explored in much richer ways. And some people are doing it in a very interesting way.
I think we are close to 2 hours now, so probably need to finish. But let me just make one promise here, because the really interesting part of mapping concerning time has not been discussed at all yet. Whereas it is important when and for what period the map was made, and how long it goes back and how long it goes forward, which is another powerful creative resource for architects and anybody who is interested in the reality. So maybe I'll make a proposal that maybe we'll see you again late autumn, when maybe life is nice to us and you could travel again, and we might think of this time aspect of mapping as well, because they take into consideration these two basic modes of human understanding, space and time. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all who are going to listen the recording, and we hope to be back soon. Thank you very much, Roger.
Thanks a lot.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you. Bye.
Very good. Thank you very much.